Good morning. Welcome to Shattering Myths, the program devoted to those of you who have come to realize that all of the world's religious, political, economic, and military institutions are corrupt, even counterproductive. I'm Yahowah. Our number, if you'd like to join us over the next 2 hours, is toll-free, 877-300-7645. I don't know how many of you are following what's occurred in Greece, but you remember how leading up to the Greece catastrophe in terms of their default on payments, the fact that they were completely bankrupt. They had borrowed $360 or $70 billion, which was about 170% of their gross domestic product, and that they had very high unemployment, and they had elected a communist leader, and were in the midst of trying to increase government entitlements, pay for public work, pensions for public workers, and health care benefits and the like. So continuing to overburden a bankrupt government. And so that's how we found Greece. And then as is the condition of the world today, and I don't think it matters if it's an Islamic country or it's a socialist, secular, humanist country like Greece, whether it's a Orthodox Christian country, again like Greece, or Italy, for example, or it is a country of just a wide variety of options like the United States, almost universally today. And I think it's a product of religious indoctrination. And by religious indoctrination, I want to include Islam, Christianity, as well as socialist secular humanism, which is the national religion of the West, the religion of man, with the moral code of political correctness. What has happened is that religious individuals are incapable, and this would include those of you who have come out of the Western educational indoctrination as politically correct. You've been rendered incapable of exercising good judgment. And when you fail to exercise good judgment, when you fail to process information rationally, then almost universally a problem associated with that is the inability to be personally responsible. And part of Greece's problem is the problem that has crippled America and crippled Europe, is this dependency mentality. It's the same as much of the Islamic world too. People no longer take responsibility for their retirement, for their health care, for their personal well-being. They expect someone to take care of them. They feel like they're entitled to their food stamps, to their welfare payment, to their reverse income tax credits, to the handouts that come by way of OPEC to the Muslims living in those fiefdoms. They don't work. A disproportionate percentage of people around the world are working. I think in America it's about 50% now, or maybe a little less than 50% of those of the proper age to be engaged in work are actually working. And so there's a dependency mentality as opposed to a personal responsibility mentality, and an inability to take personal responsibility for most anything that has happened. So what we find in Greece is that the Greeks were blaming their creditors, those who had loaned them money, for terrorizing them, for blackmailing them, for putting them in this position, as opposed to taking personal responsibility for the fact that they had consistently voted for politicians who rewarded them for their vote by ever-growing government handouts, and for them taking responsibility for the course of action as it relates to pensions, Social Security, retirement, medical care, and social safety nets that bankrupt the country, too high a compensation and too little work for public sector workers, rather than taking responsibility for having made those bad choices, they blamed others. You know, if you talk to a Muslim in an Islamic country, they will almost always blame the United States and Israel, and particularly Israel, for their plight. They live miserable lives. And so they always blame Israel or the United States. Well, in the case of Greece, they're pointing the fingers at everyone except the individuals who are responsible themselves. You know, it's very much like that in the United States, where the abominator will create class warfare and talk about how everybody should pay their fair share. And even though those who are the most productive are paying a disproportionate amount of their income in taxation, you know, it's the top 20% of wage earners pay about 80% of the overall taxes to the federal government. And half of Americans are net beneficiaries of payments from the government as opposed to contributors to it. But it creates a class warfare, and there's more people now that prefer dependence to responsibility and productivity and independence. So this mentality has shirked responsibility, always blaming somebody else. Well, it's that conniving banker, it's that conniving corporation, it's somebody manipulating the system for personal gain who is depriving them of what they would otherwise have. And it's very seldom an appropriate or accurate assessment. Now, are there bankers who are selfish? Sure. Are there corporations that have survived, that are abusing their customers as opposed to creating value and serving their customers? Yeah, but most don't last very long in that mode. It's the nature of the free enterprise system. You have choice. But this is what got Greece into this problem. Now, when Greece was given more money for the agreement to increase taxes and to decrease government spending, many people said, all right, so that crisis is averted, we'll go on to the next crisis. But all that did is exacerbate the problem, because when you give someone that provides somebody with more debt, that already has more debt than they can service, all you're doing is pushing the problem further down the field and exacerbating the ultimate consequences of it. The collapse will be far greater and far more painful because nothing was resolved. It was simply pushed further down the road. Now, there is something that took place in Greece that we as Americans ought to be very wary of. First, for a little over a week, all bank accounts were frozen. The most you could withdraw was something like $45 a day out of an ATM. And you might think, okay, well, the banks have reopened, so all of that crisis has been averted. No, that's not the case. The draconian implications on access to one's own money. Now, this is after you've made the money, after you've been taxed on the money, after you've paid all manner of taxes, after you've supported your home payments, paid for everything else that you were required to fund. The money you've been able to save is no longer yours in Greece. You cannot access it. You cannot withdraw it. You cannot transfer it. You can't use it. There's still absolute restrictions on the withdrawal or transfer of funds. So a government which was wholly irresponsible in its spending, and a public that, particularly those without savings that don't seem to care about that because they were dependent on the government supplying the next check to them, don't seem to have any problem with abusing those who were more responsible. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody with savings is responsible. It doesn't mean that everybody that has means is productive. I don't want to infer that at all. There's lots of people who inherit money and who are dregs on society. But somebody that creates a business, someone that is extraordinarily talented in providing value for a business, somebody that makes things happen in a business, that is well compensated for that, and has provided for their family and provided savings for the future, those people now are screwed, blued, and tattooed. And what that means is that the incentive for anybody to invest in Greece, to build a business in Greece, to fund inventories in Greece, to hire people in Greece, to make things, build things, or serve people is nil. No one in their right mind is going to invest in a Greek hotel, even to bring tourists in. No one is going to invest in a Greek supermarkets to supply, food for Greek citizens, because their banking accounts can be frozen at any time, and they're currently frozen. So if you take the risk and you are successful, you have no access to your funds. And if you take the risk and are unsuccessful in a greedy, indulgent economy, then what's the purpose of making an investment? Beyond that, the VATs have increased in Greece. And taxation, increasing taxation, is not a means to prosperity. That is what the Laffer curve and Reagan's demonstration of an implementation of the Laffer curve demonstrated. That there is a point where taxation rates become counterproductive, that the higher you raise tax rates like the VAT in Greece, the less money overall the government receives, and the more throttled the economy becomes. And that's what has just been imposed on Greece. And there's a failure to understand that supply-side economics has been proven. And it's just common sense that if you overtax people, then business stops growing. Business stops investing. The economy slows down. And so a larger slice of a smaller pie ends up yielding less overall tax revenue for the government, where lower tax rates of a growing pie increases overall revenues for several reasons. There is a incapacity in our overall ability to take responsibility for our own failures. I was engaged in a conversation yesterday with a pool service company, and the daughter of the owner was on the phone. Somebody I talked to previously, and I had told them that several times, 3 or 4 times last week, that pool filtration was not working correctly, pumps were not working correctly, pool was turning green. We have a problem. And they sent somebody out Friday and didn't hear back from them. And I called them on Monday and said, pool's really green. We have a problem with the pumps and obviously the chlorination of the pool. And on Tuesday, called them again, on Wednesday, and finally the owner came out and said, you got a serious problem here. Everything shut down, and it happened to be the controller. Now, they had ordered a new pump, because I said, the fountain pump appears to be running loud, so that's a problem. But didn't diagnose any of the other problems, like everything was shut down. And I said, that's your job. She said, well, you just told us about the fountain pump. I told you the pool was green. You sent somebody out. The person you sent out evidently was incapable of telling that the entire system was shut down, was incapable of running the controller for the system. Don't you think you, as a service company for a pool, since you're billing me for that, should we take some responsibility there? No, I guess we can't. We just can't please you, so we don't want to do business with you anymore. I mean, inability to take responsibility for one's own actions. I bet as part of this process of buying a home in Ohio, that I've come across it 20 times. Then I had the realtor for the sellers absolutely go through a complete meltdown on the final day of closing. You know, there happened to be an inspection item which showed that some windows had been compressed and that it was a problem around the house because the window sills were too close to the bottom of the windows, and that the windows were bowed up, and therefore many of them were now difficult or impossible to operate, and that we had declared that Pella would be who was the manufacturer of the windows, would be the sole determinant as to how many were defective and what the cure would be. And they agreed that they would be exposed to up to $10,000. Well, a senior Pella person came out, said, here are the failed windows. Cost us $15,000 to replace them. They can't be fixed. They have to be replaced. And so we withheld the $10,000 from escrow, but otherwise transferred the funds right on time, even though we were going to take a hit on this. And the opposing realtor, who knew the problem, who claimed that there was no problem, that she was here for an inspection, and denied the problem, had an absolute meltdown, citing, trying to play lawyer and citing laws and just being belligerent. We had this person in the day of close to show them the condition of the house. I said, this house is absolutely filthy and just disgusting. Filthy. We can't move anything into this house. And she didn't seem to care. You know, it required us bringing in 14 people for 10 hours. A crew of 14 professional cleaners, the kind of people that clean up, Serpro, people that clean up after fires and water damage. And just an inability of the sellers to take responsibility. Their agents to take responsibility. Every place you turn, people are unwilling to take responsibility. And I think it's pervasive, too, in business today, because businesses are comprised of individuals who have been indoctrinated in political correctness. No one exercises good judgment. No one takes personal responsibility. Well, the consequence of all that is that we all are going to be Greece. It's inevitable. Italy is next. Spain and Portugal will follow. The southern Mediterranean is going to collapse. That's just our future. The United States will ultimately lose this shell game that it's playing with quantitative easing and fiat money, as Ted Anderson says so often in his commercials, is a failed experiment. It has never lasted. It will never last. It's impossible because of the condition of man. And the way that the Torah one is ultimately going to rise to power is he's going to do the same thing that we witnessed in Cyprus, the same thing we're witnessing in Greece. He's going to promise a supply of capital so long as the savings of the wealthy are confiscated, so long as the wealthy are taxed all the more. But your debts will be forgiven if you agree with him. Interesting story telling about the grip of the Islamic religion from Bangladesh, a country that is 99.9% Islamic. It reads as follows, and this is from the New York Times, so they tell a story as if it were a story. It says, from his shop overlooking the pier on the island near the border with Myanmar, Mohammed Hossein watched the human smuggling business swell. Yes, that is the human smuggling business. Human smuggling, what is that? Slave trade?
Slave trade, kidnapping, yeah.
You know, America gets an enormous amount of blame for slavery existing in the colonies through the 1860s. Do you know how those Muslims came? How should
you answered
the
it.
Answer? Yeah. How those African came to be slaves in the first place? Did America enslave them, or were they enslaved elsewhere by others?
They were enslaved elsewhere.
Yeah, that's true. the history of
enslaved elsewhere and then sold.
Yeah, the history of the slave business in northwestern Africa is the story of initially of just pagans, of animus, and these pagans were who worshipped the witch doctors and voodoo and all that kind of stuff. They, like most human tribal systems, were vicious. There was the king wanted more people under his control and wanted absolute control over even the people in his tribe. And people, when they congregate in gangs, whether they are tribes or fiefdoms or countries, typically become more warlike. And so these African tribes were vicious, and they were vicious towards one another. And so when they would go to the neighboring community, because they wanted more land, the king wanted more people to be his subjects, they would typically kill the men and enslave the young boys and girls, and then they would rape the women as a prize. And they continued to do this until they just had more slaves than they could use. And then after they did that, they just said, there's no point here, let's just kill everybody. And so they continued to be warlike, they just were merciless and killed everyone, as opposed to doing what they considered to be the more economically advantageous thing, which was enslaving their victims. So these were simply African animus fighting other African animus. And so you don't want to take responsibility for the inception of the slave trade. African Americans ought to point the fingers at themselves, not the colonists. Now, the colonists were rotten to the core. They were despicable individuals, so I don't want to exonerate them. I just want to point out the facts historically. Now, Islam was based on the slave trade. Muhammad was a slave trader. A huge part of the initial Islamic economy was the enslavement of others. The rape of captives, which is sexual slavery, the enslavement of women and children, and then the murder of the men. And so when Islam spread from Arabia along the southern Mediterranean, it was vicious in the sense that most of the men were killed, the women were raped, and the children were enslaved. That's how Islam spread. Now, this goes to a period of time of around the late 600s, early 700 through 800 CE. So, you're looking at a time when Islam's influence in the southern Mediterranean, northern African coast, was pervasive around 8 to 900 CE, and so Muslims imposed a slavery culture and a slavery-based economy. Islam is wholly and completely fascist in its nature. So you look at the Americas, which didn't emerge until the 1600s, really. Well, by that time, Islam had been entrenched for many centuries, 5, 6, 7 centuries that Islam had imposed the slave trade. And what they did is that, all right, these pagan tribes could either convert to Islam or they'd be slaughtered, and they could, and the Muslims said, this slave trade thing that you're doing, this is a big part of what we do. We'll work together with you on that. And so, over time, the African tribes became Islamic, and they engaged with Islamic oversight in the slave trade, and then the Dutch Afrikaans, since the Muslims weren't very effective at anything that would require seafaring, the Dutch Afrikaans provided the ships to transport those that the Muslims working with Africans had enslaved. So that's the history of it. And the America's first war as a nation was against the influence. This would be now Ottoman influence in northern Africa, the Muslim influence. Even the Marine Corps anthem, from the shores of Tripoli. It was a Marine Corps landing in Tripoli for the purpose of freeing American seamen who had been captured and enslaved by the Muslims there. And the Muslims required America to pay what was, at the time, about 50% of its gross domestic product, half of its federal budget, as a ransom to prevent future enslavement. That's how Thomas Jefferson came to have a Quran, because he met with the Ottoman emissary and said, why do you do this? Why are you engaged in the slave trade? Why are you enslaving our seamen when we have never picked a fight with you? And he said, well, read our holy text, read the Quran, read the Hadith. It tells us that we will do these things, that we should do these things. And there are so many quotes from Muhammad about capturing naval vessels and enslaving the crews, and then going to places and forcing the surrender of its inhabitants to Islam, and of jihadists splitting the spoil and enslaving the women and children and raping the women. That's the story of Islam's beginning. And so the Turkish, at that time Ottoman emissary, cited these things, and Thomas Jefferson said, I've read a lot of stuff in my life. I can't even fathom that. So, well, here, take a Quran. That's how Thomas Jefferson happened to have a Quran. Now, Ellis, the congressman from Minnesota, made a big deal that he wanted to be sworn in on the Quran, and said, well, it's not just any Quran, it's Thomas Jefferson's Quran. Well, he didn't want Americans to know why Thomas Jefferson had one. It was unfathomable to Thomas Jefferson that a religion could promote kidnapping and the slave trade as something that was good, that was something that their God and prophet not only ordained but wanted them to do, sanctioned. And yet that's what he found. So America paid this huge ransom to protect its ships. So the slave trade and Islam have gone hand in hand for a very long time. And so we should not be surprised that in a country like Bangladesh that is 99% Islamic, that the human smuggling business is growing. I mean, what did we find out that was the most repulsive of the behavior? At least this is my interpretation. You may have a different perspective. But amongst the atrocious behaviors that are occurring in Iraq and Syria with the Islamic State, I don't think the most atrocious behavior are the crucifixions. I don't think the most atrocious behaviors are the tortures of little boys with iron rods. I don't think the most horrible behaviors are them cutting off the heads of civilians and putting them on fence posts for all to be terrorized. I think the worst of their behavior is their enslavement of little girls, and then offering the slave girls as sex slaves to reward jihadists, and even funding their jihad by selling at auctions naked little, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old girls who are gang raped daily, tens of thousands of them by the Islamic State. So this is something that is germane to Islam, always been part of Islam. And so long as we tolerate Islam, so long as presidents speak highly of Islam, so long as governments and militaries and intelligence agencies excuse Islam and people don't hold it accountable for its actions, we'll continue to see the human smuggling business swell. The New York Times article then says, over the years, the trickle gradually grew into an unending stream. The late-night flashes of light on the water signaling that the coast was clear to launch boats multiplied until they looked like summer lightning. That the boats were not carrying fish was an open secret here. One day, when a trawler sank on its way out, the water was littered with floating human bodies. The people of Shah-Pior-Drip, fishermen, shopkeepers, police officers, and bosses, criminal bosses, were all drawn in as participants or concerned observers into a multi-million-dollar human smuggling business that has its roots deep into this impoverished corner of Bangladesh. Now, the New York Times is incapable of making the connection between human smuggling and Islam, and the fact that Muhammad was engaged in the human smuggling business, that he condoned it, that he funded Islam on the slave trade. So they just want to blame it on, well, they're impoverished. If they only had more money, if they had more opportunity, it wouldn't exist. Well, they're never going to have opportunity so long as Islam plagues their culture. But the cause of this isn't economic impoverishment. It's spiritual and moral and religious impoverishment throughout Bangladesh, which is totally Islamic. The outside world came to know of the smuggling this spring through a series of artful revelations, according to the New York Times. Shallow graves were discovered in makeshift camps in Thailand, near the Malaysian border, where the smugglers abused and starved their captives by abuse. Beat them, raped them, tormented them, and then starved them to death. Demanding as much as $3,000 from their families for their release. You either pay us what would be a year's or multiple years' wage in Bangladesh for the son or daughter that we have kidnapped, or we will rape them, we will torture them, we will starve them to death, and then ultimately we will discard them in a shallow grave. Well, Glenn, I know that you called the other day and expressed your weariness of hearing the evil that is Islam. But don't these young boys and girls and their parents deserve a voice?
Oh, yes, this is truly horrific, of course.
Yes.
But, I got thinking about this concept of slavery. I mean, I'm not just weary of Islam. I'm weary of the lies and violence of American politicians and stuff like that, too.
Yeah.
But the essence of slavery, aside from the stupidity of the notion of one human owning another, but the essence of it is that it's exploitive, oppressive, burdensome, grinds people down and ruins quality of life. It's a pretty horrible way to live. And I was just sitting here thinking, I think I would rather have lived as one of Thomas Jefferson or George Washington's slaves than to be a modern Chinese employee in an Apple Foxconn factory.
Yeah.
Because I suspect I would have more nightly sleep and family time and rest. Like, I get the feeling Jefferson probably wasn't terribly oppressive to his slaves, though I certainly don't know.
I've been in the factories in China, and I've seen the dormitories that are built. I've seen the meals that they are served, and I see the people come. I see what they wear. While free enterprise is certainly stratified in China, and while I'm certain that there are worse conditions than the conditions that I saw, the conditions I saw in terms of dormitories were pretty decent. The beds were decent. Were the hours long? Yes, they worked 6 days a week. They worked 12 hours a day. They were paid what they considered to be an extraordinary wage, one that we would consider paltry, and they used part of their wage to buy meals that we would consider to be inadequate. It's all true. But they came freely, and they sought these jobs. And they're jobs that free enterprise provided and that countries desiring the products that they were making wanted. And the more factories that were built, the better it was for these people, because the more employers that were seeking employees, the more the employee made. In fact, I remember in the 10 years that I was doing this, how the wage paid to the workers doubled and tripled over that period of time. Now, you know, I think, yeah, can I share something with you that is a insight that I came to very late in life. I always wondered why Yahowah doesn't condemn human slavery in the sense of condemning slave owners and telling his people that you should never enslave anyone, and he doesn't. He doesn't say that. He does speak a lot of slavery. And there are two references to slavery that finally caused me to understand what he was talking about. One of them is that, yeah, well, what his two real interesting, long discussions or repetitive discussions on slavery are how the children of Israel were slaves in the crucible of Egypt, in Mitzrayim, and how he came up with a plan where he personally engaged to free them. And it's one of the most important stories because it's the same path we walk from being enslaved by human institutions to our freedom. And the second is the Yobel. And that the realization in the Yobel that all slaves are free. If you're going to be a Torah-observant person, if you're going to deploy Yahowah's approach to economics and politics, if you will, that every 50 years, if a person was enslaved, he's going to be free. And so when we return, I'd love to, even after the break, to talk about why it is that way.